I've heard statements like yours consistently over the last 30 years. People like you have been making these statements about China on a hot tin roof, about to collapse, and so on and so forth. And I would say for 20 years I've been writing that it won't happen. You can go, what you do today, China will do tomorrow. So if you aggressively carry out naval patrolling 12 miles off China's shores, they've already begun, I think, off Hawaii, Pacific, or Guam, but they will reach California. The Chinese Navy will carry out aggressive naval patrolling of California. And I think that's not necessary.
大家好，我是老吴。今天我们来看一段非常精彩的问答交锋。这场对话发生在哥伦比亚大学，美国顶级的学术殿堂之一。台上是我们非常熟悉的新加坡知名学者马凯硕，而台下向他轮番发难的是几位资深的美国政府官员和学者。他们提问题的角度很有意思，字里行间都带着一种不自觉的优越感，与其说是在请教，更像是在进行一场居高临下的拷问。而他们提出的问题，与其说是疑虑，不如说是西方世界针对中国的那一套经典的批判性叙事，充满了我们熟悉的双标和自以为是的味道。从南海的军事威胁到中国内部的稳定与人权，这些话题我们平时在西方媒体上听的耳朵都起茧了。但最有意思的就是看马凯硕如何回应，他总是那么稳稳当当，就像太极高手，见招拆招，四两拨千斤。他说唱衰中国的论调，他已经听了整整30年，言下之意就是你们少来这一套，这一套早就过时了。那么面对这些典型的充满偏见的提问，马凯硕是如何瓦解他们的逻辑，甚至反将一军的？接下来咱们就走进这场精彩的对话。
I want to ask about sources of American mistrust of China. I agree with you that we should get the size of the China threat correct. They're not invading us, etc. But it seems to me there really is an important strategic area of friction with China, which has to do with Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, and the fact that the United States has been militarily dominant there for all these years, and China doesn't like that and wants to change it. And I think that's an important source of perhaps not world war, but of real conflict. And you haven't mentioned that. You act as if it's just the so-called values question, but there really are some strategic issues. And we don't really know the extent of China's strategic ambition, what the Belt and Road is going to be, what the port in Djibouti is going to be, how much they need in order to feel safe. We don't have a good sense of that. So I wanted you to talk about the sort of hard material aspects of the security issue.
Thank you. I'm actually very surprised that Andy doesn't disagree with me that much. No, but you're right. I mean, there are many areas of contention, and in fact, you can also give a lecture on the military slice, the economic slice, and other cultural slice of the competition, and so on and so forth. But on the military slice, Andy, my response to you is that the Chinese have a very nuanced view of the American military presence in the region. For example, I don't think that the Chinese want you to walk away from your defense alliance with Japan, because an independent Japan will become a nuclear Japan, and they don't want that. So they actually value having the US alliance with Japan. And by the way, both you and I were discussing Kissinger's book on China, and how Mao Zedong actually told Kissinger, you must spend more time in Japan, you must look after Japan. I mean, that's amazing, Mao Zedong saying, Japan is an important country, you must take care of it. So the Chinese have a very nuanced view of these countries. But at the same time, I know the one thing that the Chinese are very, very angry about, and this is a fact, is the aggressive naval patrolling by US naval vessels 12 miles off China's shores. That really upsets them, because whenever any country will do this, by the way. Including China. That's right. So they and I actually believe that what you do today, China will do tomorrow. So if you aggressively carry out naval patrolling 12 miles off China's shores, they've already begun, I think, off Hawaii, Pacific, or Guam, but they will reach California. The Chinese Navy will carry out aggressive naval patrolling of California. And I think that's not necessary. Neither side benefits from it. And of course, the rationale for the American Navy for doing so is that we are protecting freedom of navigation. And ironically, the country that needs freedom of navigation more than America does is the world's #1 exporter, which is China. China actually wants greater freedom of navigation than the United States does. So the Chinese will be happy to work with you in that area. But when it comes to the aggressive naval patrolling, or as you know, in the case of planes that fly close to Chinese borders, that's what really upsets them. And they are trying very hard to reach an understanding within that area. Now, South China Sea is another issue, okay? Now, the South China Sea issue is a complicated issue. As you know, several countries are claiming reefs and rocks, and over there are 4 ASEAN countries: Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, and then Taiwan and China are claiming there. And it's true that the Chinese have been claiming a lot of land in the South China Sea. But the Chinese didn't start this game, by the way. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately because the Malaysians and Filipinos had no idea what would happen. They claimed 2 acres, 3 acres. The Chinese said, okay, you claim, I claim. But the Chinese claim 2,000 acres. But it's a game that they unfortunately started, and they're stuck with it now. Now, this is how the Chinese are being assertive. Now, if they want to be aggressive, the Chinese can remove the Malaysian, Filipino, Brunei, Malaysian soldiers, Vietnamese soldiers off those islands in 24 hours. They can do it if they really want to be aggressive. And by the way, that's what the United States would have done in 1897. But China in 2018 will not do that. And that, to some extent, shows some degree of restraint now. How will the South China Sea issue be resolved? I can tell you it will be resolved eventually through various kinds of bilateral negotiations. And this has been documented and studied, Andy. In fact, it's in one of your readings, I saw that too. The Chinese have been very generous in their border settlements, except for only the 3 that have not resolved yet. But most of the time, when they resolve border issues, they've been quite generous. They say, okay, you take more, I take less. So that will be part of the negotiations that will carry on. But again, a lot depends on whether or not you're dealing with an angry China that feels is being pushed around, or a China that says, okay, you treat me with respect, I treat you with respect. We can work together. I think that's what's going to happen. But I can take a bet with any of you that there'll be no war in the South China Sea in 2018. Come and see me after the...
2018 is a short time frame. But let me invite Jerry Cohen to add his voice and question.
I know he'll disagree with me more.
I admire your courage in coming back here and telling us how we should set things right. And I think you would be surprised at the extent to which many of us agree with your message, certainly the burden. I'm not an economist. We have many distinguished economists here. I'd love to hear them address the issue whether the next 40 years will be as promising for China's economy and development as the past 40 have been, as you rightly point out. I would love to have you also talk about, you mentioned mildly, there's no freedom of speech in China. I think you have to recognize the reality of what's been taking place in recent years. There is increasing repression. If things were so good for the growing middle class that the economic development has spawned, why the need for increasing repression, arbitrary detention, lawlessness, party domination of the judicial institutions as well as, why is that necessary?
Why is there increasing repression? And the honest answer I can give you is that at the end of the day, the Chinese believe that for the 1.4 billion people to continue to do well, you need to have a very high degree of political order and stability. And Chinese history teaches you that when the center weakens, the Chinese word for chaos, I think is luan or something like that, chaos returns. So they actually believe as a principle of China's rule that strong central control is always necessary. Now, when you talk of, let's say, higher levels of repression, the question is, which is the benchmark you're using? I mean, certainly if you use Mao's times, things obviously are much better. If you look in terms of I don't have the data, I think you do, on the number of political prisoners and so on and so forth. But I would say, on balance, if you go to China on a day-to-day basis, you don't see that in front of you, I would say when I used to go to China in the early 1980s, there was still a sense of fear. It was there, right? Today, that sense of fear has diminished. And you're right, it's a complex story, but if you give any Chinese government the choice between stability and order or allowing dissent and chaos, they will choose stability and order. And that's what they will do.
I would say you have a very optimistic view of the situation in Taiwan, and you have a very optimistic view of the internal situation in China. You keep saying, if the Chinese are one leader and the people around him now, they're huge members of the elite who are very unhappy. Xi Jinping's father, after 16 years in the Maoist wilderness, came back in the early 80s, and he preached to the party, we will never achieve our goals unless we allow differences of opinion. 不同意见. Despite his preference for Confucianism, which makes Shao, filial piety, so crucial, Xi Jinping has gone against the advice of his father. He was a Chinese too. And there are many Chinese in the elite who are against the current repression, which is why you have the repression. So I think China is a more unstable place, and Xi Jinping knows it better than the rest of us in terms of the corruption, the poverty, the environmental problems. He knows, I think China is a cat on a hot tin roof that has a terrific worldwide PR system right now. So I think we have to be realistic in looking at what's going on in China.
Yeah. Let me tell you where I agree and disagree with you, Jerry. I agree with you that Xi Jinping is acutely aware of the tensions within China. I agree with you that. Let me tell you where I disagree with you. I've heard statements like yours consistently over the last 30 years. People like you have been making these statements about China on a hot tin roof, about to collapse, and so on and so forth. And I would say for 20 years I've been writing that it won't happen. You can go back to my first book, A Nation's Thing. It's a very definitive essay down there saying, you got it wrong. Okay. So that China will keep on growing. It will become stronger. It will remain stable. It will have a bigger economy. It will educate more of its people. It will send more of its young people overseas. More of its young people overseas will go back to the repressive country. It will continue to send not 120 million, but 2 years from now, 200 million Chinese overseas, and 200 million Chinese will return overseas to the repressive society you speak about. So that's the data I give back to you.
But the issue isn't whether China is quote unquote ready for democracy. There are 1,001 excuses why democracy is inconvenient to any authoritarian government. The question is whether China has the legitimacy from institutions, whether China has the processes that will allow it to sustain social stability and economic development over time. So that's one issue. The second issue is I think you're awfully benign in your interpretation of China's behavior. The huge mistake that's commonly made in Washington and elsewhere is to conflate China's rise with China's actions. And the actions that are generating so much mistrust include not only the reclamation of land in the South China Sea, but the threats and the interference with the shipping and the activities of rival claimants and smaller powers. So the principle here is not that the freedom of navigation operations by the 7th Fleet of the US Navy is threatening to China. The issue is that unless and until little Brunei has the ability to sail throughout the South China Sea in international waters without being threatened by the Chinese, then the global principle of freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, which you rightly point out China ought to prize, is subject to the China exception. And that, I think, is a manifestation of the behavior that generates such anxiety in connection with China's rise.
Thank you.
Thank you. I must say that's very helpful, constructive feedback, because I'm actually looking for points like this that I can deal with in the book. One, the three key words you use, one is about the democracy issue, which you said is a red herring. So I would say, is it possible to persuade the United States to stop saying in its public statements, like the one I quoted from the George W. Bush, that China should become a democracy? Why don't we let the Chinese decide whether they want to become a democracy? Why does the United States have to tell China you should become a democracy? I mean, as I said, from the point of view of a future historian, why is this young nation giving advice to old civilizations? You know, so I would say that if you can do that, then you'll stop being a problem. But if you continue to use it regularly, it actually, what it does is that, you know, this is something I don't want to, I'm just going to mention in passing, okay, but there's a huge cultural dimension to this problem also. There is a fear of what is called the yellow peril deeply embedded in the subconsciousness of Western history. And it's a big subject. But when you keep using the democracy thing, is part of a weapon to try and keep that distrust up. That's why I say, let the Chinese decide how they're going to become a democracy. Then I would say, then the problem will be such a big problem. The second big question you use, a very critical word, is legitimacy. Now, that's why the question I want to ask very simply is, how many countries in the world view the Chinese government as a legitimate government of the Chinese people? And how many countries in the world view the Chinese government as an illegitimate government? As an ambassador to UN, I can tell you the vast majority of governments in the world see the Chinese government as a legitimate government. And the sources of legitimacy in the West come from the process of election to power. The sources of legitimacy, and I can refer you to a TED talk by someone called Eric Lee. Look at the competence of the Chinese government. Look at what they have done for the Chinese people. And you can say, surely many other governments would wish that they could do as much for their people in terms of improving the human condition of the population. And that, I would say, is the fundamental source of their legitimacy. Now, thirdly and finally, on South China Sea, as you know, the United States has become a key actor on the South China Sea issue. But what the Chinese say is that the United States is always advocating that China should abide by the norms of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in South China Sea. They say, why doesn't the United States ratify the convention then? Because I think once you do that, if you don't do that, you have no moral legitimacy to advise others. If you don't respect a convention, how can you ask others to respect the convention?
好，精彩对话我们就看到这里。很明显，美国老提的问题基本上涵盖了中国威胁论的几个主要方面：战略上的、制度上的、人权上的。但马凯说的厉害之处在于，他并没有陷入到是或者不是的简单争论里，他总是能跳出框架，从一个更高的也更现实的维度来回应。比如，他用己所不欲，勿施于人的道理，点出了美国海军抵近侦察的双重标准。他用美国自己还没有批准联合国海洋公约的事实，指出了美国在南海问题上缺乏道德制高点。而最有力的一击就是那句像你们这样的论调，我过去30年一直在听。这说明了一个现实，很多西方所谓的专家、所谓的精英，他们观察中国的理论框架充满了偏见和双标，他们的问题总是那些老问题，就是无法接受中国健康发展的事实。所以看完这场对话，我在想，当一个古老的文明以一种完全不同的方式重新崛起时，真正需要改变的不是这个崛起的国家，而是那些提问者看待世界的傲慢眼光。好了，今天的分享就到这里，感谢大家收看，我们下次再见。